Let me go back now to these books that we referenced at the top. We referenced them and kind of moved right past them. I want to go back and give you a chance to unpack what is meant by these titles. When you write a book called How Nonviolence Protects the State, when you write another book called The Failure of Nonviolence, what's the message you're trying to get out about nonviolence specifically? Because those who believe, say, in Kingian nonviolence, when they hear a book called The Failure of Nonviolence, I think it might prick their ears.
Yeah. Basically, these books, both of them in different historical moments, because the first one was written about 8 years ago, they analyze how nonviolence functions within movements for social change to make sure that those movements will continuously be co-opted, to make sure that they don't go beyond the barriers that have been set up to acceptable change under government, under capitalism. The Failure of Nonviolence, the most recent book, focuses on what nonviolence looks like today. And nonviolence today, while it may make a lot of brief references to Martin Luther King or to Gandhi, both of whom participated in complex struggles that included nonviolent elements as well as more combative elements, the actual face of nonviolence today has changed a lot. It's reflected a lot more by the method of nonviolence espoused by Gene Sharp, which is a method associated with, for example, the so-called color revolutions of the last years. These were basically mass movements that flooded the streets, flooded the squares, and used a very lowest common denominator sort of discourse. Each movement had a single word slogan and a color that they identified with, and they basically created a crisis in governance. Now, a crisis in governance is not enough to create an actual social transformation because it doesn't change who has power. It simply means that those in power need to change their masks, they need to offer up another false solution, and that's what's happened in every single one of these color revolutions. I could just as easily have called this book The Success of Nonviolence, because if you look at all the successes of nonviolent social movements over the last 20 years, that's the maximum of what they've accomplished. They've accomplished a cosmetic change in which those in power shift around, but the same fundamental problems continue. And then they go on to hail these changes as a victory.
So if nonviolence worked for Gandhi and it worked for King, what's bankrupt about nonviolence as we know it today? I hear your critique. I'm just trying to figure out now what's missing for those who believe in nonviolent struggles, for those who practice that in a contemporary setting. What's missing?
Well, first of all, I think we need to question the idea that nonviolence worked for King and for Gandhi, because both of those were at best partial victories. Institutionalized racism continues perhaps stronger than before in the United States. India shifted from being a colony to a neo-colony. It's still exploited by a lot of the same powers. It has a political system inherited from colonialism. But those achievements, those partial victories that each of those movements achieved, can't be attributed solely to nonviolence. They came from movements that used a diversity of tactics. During the civil rights movement, for example, you had Martin Luther King. You also had groups like the Deacons of Defense that practiced armed self-defense against the violence of the Klan or the violence of the police. In fact, a number of times Martin Luther King in his marches and rallies used the Deacons of Defense to protect them. Or you also have the Black Panthers and then a number of urban uprisings, for example, the riots in Birmingham that are really the direct predecessor, the direct trigger for the Civil Rights Act. And then if you look at King's evolution, his political evolution later in life, he started talking about being in solidarity with the Vietnamese in their struggle against U.S. occupation. He started talking sympathetically with young black urban rioters. And the kind of nonviolence that we have today is this extreme denunciation of any form of social struggle that is illegal, that is combative, that is forceful, that doesn't ask for permission, and that doesn't wait and play by the rules. It's a nonviolence that has people cooperating with the mass media, cooperating with the police against fellow protesters, against fellow activists and other people in the streets in order to eliminate all of those other forms of struggle. So I think that there's obviously room in a social struggle, in a social movement for all different sorts of people, for people who prefer peaceful methods, for people who prefer direct action and self-defense. But those who prefer peaceful methods, I think they need to stop identifying with an exclusive nonviolence and acknowledge that all social movements are heterogeneous, all social movements are diverse, and they can't control other people's participation in a social movement. They should start looking towards how they can cooperate, how these different forms of participation can complement one another.
You know, in about a week, we're going to be together in New York City, a number of us saluting the great Dorothy Day, who, as you know, was an anarchist, as was Bayard Rustin, and as was Henry David Thoreau, as is Noam Chomsky, and others. But she seems to actually be a figure, and I'd like to get you to reflect a bit on her, who recognized that reform was never enough, and that even nonviolent attempts to reform would never be enough. But she also recognized that revolution, though desirable in terms of a fundamental transformation of a society done in a humane way, seemed to be so marginal or so unlikely, and therefore she's caught on a tightrope between reform and revolution. But what do you make of her dilemma, Domingue?
Well, I think Dorothy Day is an important historical figure to remember. I don't necessarily see a dilemma between reform and revolution. I think that we need to fight for revolution. I think we need to fight for total social transformation, even if it's highly unlikely. I mean, if Dorothy Day recognized it as unlikely in her time, it's even more unlikely in our times. But by shooting for the moon, that really is also one of the best chances of making things better in small ways right here and right now. I mean, most of the major reforms that actually constitute betterments of our lives, because a lot of reforms, most reforms probably are really just a shuffling of the cards and a way to co-opt people's energy to rejuvenate the system. But the few reforms that actually make life better, like, for example, having the 8-hour workday, or health care, or bathroom breaks, or people being able to go into whatever bar or restaurant or public space they want, regardless of their skin color. Really, those changes came about when people went for broke, tried to shoot the moon and totally transform society, and upset the system so much that those in power had to offer something. They had to give away something in order to keep from losing the whole game.
No, I think you're right about that, though. It's just that, especially among the younger generation, you know, how do you make a case that a commitment to moral integrity, even if the consequences are something far down the road, is worth opting for? We live in a short-term society, market-driven, obsessed with capital, obsessed with status, wealth, position, and stature, and therefore the idea of the life that you lived, though, Brother Peter, which I see is very similar to Dorothy Day and King, which is to say, look, regardless of the consequences, this is the kind of person I want to be, and that means I will be a revolutionary who tells the truth about the depths of exploitation and domination, even if I'm pushed to the margins, and even if it looks as if the one-dimensional society, use the language of Herbert Marcuse, will co-opt the movement, will repress the movement, will somehow dilute the movement, and I attempt to preserve not purity but integrity. I mean, can that case be made, especially to the younger generation?
I think so. I think in the last years, you've seen a lot more young people start to rebel, start to think for themselves. I think they're paying a lot less attention to the mass media. All across the world now, you see different movements like that. You have the student movement in the UK. You have some of the most marginalized youth, immigrant youth, and youth of color in the US rising up in response to police violence or the racism of immigration policy in the United States in the last few years. In Chile, for example, there's a huge student movement with students going on strike and taking over the streets. To a lesser extent, there's always also been a strong student movement here in Spain, also with students going on strike and taking over the streets. So I mean, it always starts with a small group, doing what they have to do regardless of the consequences, and sometimes that resonates with people, and a small drop becomes a big wave, and it just takes off. But
Peter, I wonder whether your version of rebellion or revolution tolerates violence of any sort, and if so, under what conditions?
Well, I think my major criticism of nonviolence, or at least the first one, is that violence isn't a meaningful category. I mean, in this one box, in this one word, we have things like what governments do, like carpet bombing cities or forcing entire populations into mass starvation, or locking people up in solitary confinement for years on end, like Herman Wallace, who just died after 41 years in solitary for a crime he didn't commit, with other kinds of activities that are also described as violent that include self-defense. For example, queer and trans people defending themselves from homophobic attackers on the streets, or people who have been kicked out of their houses for not being able to pay the mortgage, smashing the bank that did that to them. So we're also talking about destruction of property, people on the bottom of the social hierarchy rising up against people on top, and those different activities, the activity of the powerful and those of the rest of us, follow completely different logics, and I don't think they actually reproduce one another. So I think that self-defense is completely legitimate. I think destroying the structures in our society that are poisoning us, that are exploiting us, is completely legitimate. And what we do have, for example, like the 8-hour workday, or women being able to participate as equals in society, or an end to at least legal segregation, if not other forms of institutionalized racism, those didn't come from people following the law and being only peaceful, although there were peaceful forms of participation in all those movements. They came from people fighting back. And if we don't recognize the tactics that gave us what little we have as legitimate, tactics like the strike, sabotage, defending ourselves from the police, from state surveillance, from armed racists, if we can't recognize those things as legitimate, then we might as well just give up what little we still have that they haven't been able to take from us.
I mean, your argument, for example, would certainly support the spirit of the nation that Nelson Mandela and others founded in South Africa, which was armed struggle, though, right?
Absolutely.
Indeed. But I mean, I think we make a distinction, Brother Tavis making a distinction between rebellion and revolution. Rebellion being the expression of the outrage of those who have been mistreated and abused, and it's not tied to a plan. It may not even be tied to a vision. It's just a kind of cathartic expression that does generate concessions from the powers that be, as opposed to a much more revolutionary conception of structural transformation, where people are really tied to a certain vision of the world and has organizations that are attuned to that vision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think often rebellions give rise to revolutions. Rebellions give people practice in learning that they can stand up for themselves, and then it shows them a farther horizon. And then within that, of course, there's going to be a lot of disagreement. There's going to be a lot of conflict about what's acceptable and what's not, what's helpful and what's harmful. But those decisions can't be handed down from above. They certainly can't be written in some book and imposed across an entire society. They need to happen through face-to-face conflict and criticism and engagement. We need to accept that conflict is actually a good thing within our social movements, so that when other people do things that we find are harmful, we don't freak out and run and denounce them to the press or to the police, but we make those criticisms and we show a different, better way of doing things while moving forward and recognizing that none of us have the ultimate answers, and we're learning as we go.
I think you're right, Peter, about the fact that conflict is good. I don't think there's any disagreement there. I guess the question is where the line is between responding to your oppressors and becoming just like your oppressors. That was the rub for Gandhi and King, that you don't want to become like those who oppress you.
I think that's actually a really important consideration. Myself, as an anarchist, I approach that question differently than proponents of nonviolence tend to approach it. I don't think rebelling or fighting back is what makes someone like their oppressor. I think it's taking power and holding power over others. So someone who defends themselves, they're not oppressing the person that they're defending themselves from. In fact, if that person is a bully, whether an institutional bully or just a bully on a personal level, by facing that resistance, they're actually getting an opportunity to learn, to correct their ways, and to stop being this oppressive figure. If you don't have an ethic of anti-authoritarianism or of equality and sharing and mutual aid, then when you win in a struggle, you have the opportunity to turn yourself into a new authority. So the typical example is the Russian Revolution, where the Bolsheviks took power and then they became the new authorities, possibly even worse than the ones that came before them. But this wasn't because they took the path of armed struggle. The Bolsheviks always had an authoritarian ideology. From the beginning, they were promising to inaugurate a dictatorship, and that's exactly what they did. But there were also many other people, other kinds of socialists and anarchists participating in that revolution